Hello friends. Welcome to the Bones Fiction. How are you all? So in this video, we will see what if Gohan had the power of universal justice. But before we start, if you want more amazing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, if possible, share this video. Gohan ran through the forest terrified. His daddy wasn't anywhere to be seen, and yet he could have sworn that he was just there a second ago. Coming to a small clearing not far from where he lost track of his daddy and yet far away from home, Gohan was breathing hard, lost, and was extremely scared. What was a big cool fun forest with his father was now dark and looming. Every rustle and shadow seemed to be reaching out to get him, knowing that they could now that his strong daddy was not here to protect him. Clutching at his yellow-green dress robe that his mother insisted on him wearing, Gohan felt tears well up in his eyes. In all his 4 years of age, he could always be assured that his mommy or daddy would be there for him should he really need them. Sure, his dad was always out training or something, and mommy was always making him study those boring books, but they were always there for him, and they always ate mommy's delicious dinner together as a family. Sniffling, and jumping terribly at an unexpected snap from the bushes behind him that he had just come from, Gohan shakily turned to see what it was. A desperate sort of hope sprang forth in his chest. Daddy? Is that you?" His wavering voice could barely be heard over the rustling trees and bumbling forest. Gohan's tail twitched agitatedly behind him, the hairs puffing out in alarm and swishing uneasily. When another crack was the only response he received, resounding through the small green grassy patch Gohan had managed to find for himself, his tail stopped moving. Instead now it stuck straight up behind him, the fur fluffed out and immobile. A little louder this time, Gohan hesitantly called for his father. Daddy." It was as though the entire forest had gone still. The snaps had stopped as well as the movement of other animals in the surrounding area. There were no insects buzzing and no birds chirping. The only sound was the wind running its fingers gently through the tree branches, fondly rustling the leaves as though being reunited with a long-lost lover. Gohan felt himself go still. His senses felt sharper and he could almost feel the forest around him. The leaves became sharper, the colors around him more vivid. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified almost unbearably to him. Above it all he could feel his own heartbeat, his breathing short and shallow in his panic. And just as suddenly and stealthily as it had come, like the silence before the storm, the forest erupted into a flurry of motion. A large saber-toothed lion with a mane seemingly spun out of golden sunlight launched itself out of the bushes directly at Gohan. Gohan felt as though the world had slowed down around him and yet sped up at the same time. He could see the approaching predator, and he knew with a crystal-clear clarity what would happen to him should he fail to escape. Death. He could feel the lion's breaths, could hear its strong heartbeat, could feel the adrenaline pumping through its veins. The anticipation of a kill, the taste of blood on the tip of T's tongue. There was no evil in it, there was just instinct, survival of the fittest, and what it saw was easy prey in its territory. Next moment he felt as the lion's dinner plate-sized paws pulled up on each side of him, almost like a large hug. He could see and feel as the lion's massive and powerful maw came towards him, aiming to wrap around his throat and impale him on the long and powerful 2 frontal fangs. He could feel the end fast approaching, and he felt his own blood rise up in response to the lion's. Gohan couldn't even feel himself moving, nor was he conscious of it, but next thing he knew, he was no longer in that green grassy patch that his father had left him in. Instead, he was now in one of the many large trees growing on the side of Mount Paozu. He was at the very top of the tree, clutching the highest standing branch for dear life. Barely comprehending what had just happened to him, looking down he could see the lion as it landed sprightly on its feet. He saw it as it looked round, sniffed the air and ground in question. The lion looked up and Gohan's Onyx eyes met the captivating golden orbs of the lion's. Frozen solid, Gohan and the lion just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity and yet couldn't have been more than a minute. When the lion licked its and turned and walked away, breaking eye contact at last, Gohan felt all the tension built up in his body drain out more and more with every step the lion took away from him. Feeling something snap in his emotions, the adrenaline draining out of his body, Gohan felt the warm rivulets flowing freely down his face. He didn't know how long he had been crying, but he didn't care. He really was into it now. Hiccuping and having trouble breathing, his sobs were so great, Gohan felt snot clog up his nose and it was not pretty. That was how his father finally found him a short time later. Gohan was still clutching the tree branch for dear life, shaking the whole tree with the power of his heart-wrenching sobs. His dad pulled up behind him on the Nimbus cloud and with the traditional sun grin, scratched the back of his head. "Hey Gohan, what's wrong?" Freezing momentarily at the sound of his dad's voice, sniffling powerfully, shudders racking his whole body, Gohan turned slowly to see his father. His strong daddy was there and he was safe. Nothing was going to get to him when his daddy was there. Absolutely nothing. Goku sat with his legs crossed on the flying Nimbus with Gohan snuggled in his arms, speeding over the tops of trees and land so fast they were only a blur in the sky to the average onlooker. As he chugged along with the flying Nimbus securely underneath him, he couldn't help but puzzle at how he had found Gohan earlier that day. Chi-Chi would never let him train Gohan, which he found confusing seeing as by her justification he wasn't old enough for training. But if that was true, then how was he old enough for all those books and all that studying that she had him doing? Whenever Goku asked this question, however, he got an iron skillet to the head, and because it was his wife he couldn't exactly dodge or block it on the rare occasion that he saw it coming. If he did dodge it though, then Chi-Chi would just get even more angry and he'd end up getting more than just one little goose egg on his noggin. He knew from experience. But wait a second, if he was never able to train Gohan, then how had he gotten all the way up to the top of that tree? Goku jumped slightly when Gohan jolted unexpectedly in his sleep, causing him to feel a warm pressure around his arm. Looking down, he saw that Gohan had his tail tightly wrapped around his forearm. Smiling, Goku shuffled Gohan's hair slightly off of his face. He was sitting criss-cross on Nimbus with Gohan reclining across his lap and against his chest, hugged in his arms. Almost resembling the way Goku had first held him when he had just been a baby. He could still remember the day he had come into existence, all of the panic and pain. Goku had had no clue what to do. He could still remember the afterpart though, what had come subsequent to all the screams and blood that was commonly associated with childbirth. The tired doctor had brought the baby to him, and he had simply stared at the little bundle of life in his arms that he had somehow helped to create. He was sleeping peacefully then, just as he was now. Feeling a warmth and peace hover around him and inside him, he could tell that Nimbus was somehow affected by it as well. Nimbus always had a strange way of knowing those kinds of things. Going more at a cruise now, the Nimbus slowed down to a more moderate speed. Goku could feel his friends at the Kame house just ahead. Speaking of heads, Goku rubbed his. Kai had not been pleased with him going to visit with Gohan, especially with the state the boy had been in at the time. The poor kid was almost inconsolable after Goku found him at the top of the tree. All he managed to comprehend from the youngster was a mixture of daddy, lion, teeth, tree, gold, and a whole lot of wailing. Imagine Chi-Chi and her maternal instinct going haywire at the sight of her offspring in such a state, even if by the time the two had gotten home Gohan had calmed considerably. Just the sight of her baby in distress had her on edge and angry. He had no clue how he had managed to convince her to let him take Gohan to the reunion. It must have been the promise to keep him safe and be back before dinner. He almost chuckled at the thought that it was something she thought she had to ask of him for it to be. He would never miss a meal, and so long as he was alive, and he wouldn't let anything happen to his precious loved ones either. Seeing the little island with the pink house resting on it that said, Kame House, on the front in white, he was flushed with excitement and nostalgia. He could feel Krillin, Bulma, and of course Master Roshi. The small gang all together bringing back memories of past adventures and battles. He had to wonder though, and when the cloud landed after the initial hugs and introduction he asked about the missing Yamcha. Upon receiving a very heated, angry reply from Bulma and a sheepish Krillin off in the back just seeming as though he had already heard it many times before, Goku just rolled with it. Much the same as many things in his life. He supposed that he could just see the final member of the group another time. When a grunt could be heard off to where he had left Nimbus and Gohan, he went over. After Nimbus had come to a stop he had gracefully jumped off the cloud without disturbing Gohan, carefully unwrapping his tail from his arm and laying him so that he was curled up on it in such a way that he could remain sleeping. Goku was going to check on where he had left him at that moment, but Bulma beat him to it, and if her shocked exclamation didn't wake Gohan up right then the yelling she did immediately after seeing Gohan certainly would. Goku. There is a sleeping kid on the Nimbus cloud with your hair. He looks just like you. She said the last part as Gohan rose into a slouching sitting position on the cloud. revealing his still half-asleep face as well as his yawning mouth. He also did a few customary one-armed just waking up stretches with his eyes clenched shut and his toddler hands fisted. When his tail came out from behind him waving from side to side looking like a fishing hook, Bulma had another loud exclamation, causing Gohan to wince and look around a little more awake and more fluidly. Goku half smiled, half winced in empathy. His own ears were really sensitive. He guessed that he had passed that trade down to Gohan. When Gohan did look around at his surroundings completely conscious and awake at last, his tail came more into view and it swayed from side to side lazily. "Goku. Look at that, he has a tail just like you did when you were a kid," Bulma said just as loudly, if not more so than before. Krillin had joined her by this time, both of them side by side and creeping up close and closer. They seemed more scared at this point when she said that. It made Goku confused. Why would they be worried about Gohan? Goku, feeling bashful but proud, went up behind Gohan and Nimbus, picked up Gohan from under his little armpits and held him out like a prize, saying, "This is my son, Gohan." All the dumbfounded faces pointed toward him made him laugh. He had missed his friends. It had truly been too long since they had last seen each other. He had missed them dearly as well as all the cool things that they always managed to accomplish together. The expressions they made as well were greatly missed. It was never boring with them around. Bulma and Krillin looked at each other out of the corner of their eyes, then both looked at Gohan, who had been set down at that point and was hiding behind Goku's left leg nervously glancing at them through weary eyes. You could tell that he wasn't quite used to people and was nervous around his father's friends. Bulma and Krillin still looked at each other then at Gohan, repeating the cycle numerously. Master Roshi looked somewhat nervous as well, but it was Bulma who finally asked the question that was on all their minds. "Goku, he hasn't seen the moon, has he?" At the confused look on Goku's face, they all breathed a big sigh of relief. They all knew the consequences of a kid with a tail looking directly at the full moon. Been there, done that, and they never wanted to have to be put up to that monster again. "No, why?" Goku just looked baffled. Bulma and Krillin were quick to respond, waving their hands in front of them, sweating and laughing nervously. "Oh, no reason, just make sure he doesn't look at it. You know it's, unhealthy for kids his age," Bulma said. At this Krillin looked impressed at her quick thinking, and Goku looked intrigued. She wasn't considered one of the most brilliant minds on Earth for nothing. However, Goku's wide innocent eyes were looking at her in awe and trust. And just like that, Bulma and Krillin couldn't say anything. They couldn't keep eye contact when he was like that, looking away at the sky and the ground and anywhere but at Goku and his puppy dog eyes. Ignoring the twinge of guilt for the better good, Bulma said, "Yep, you better believe it. That's why we never wanted you to look at the moon when you were a kid too." Glancing at him, Bulma saw a happy smile on Goku's face, and scratching the back of his head, Goku commented, You guys, I never knew that. Hear that, Gohan? Make sure you don't ever look at the moon." Gohan, who was still huddled behind his father's leg, looked up into his daddy's eyes and nodded solemnly. He would always listen to his dad no matter how foolish his request seemed. His daddy rarely ever made demands of him, and when he did, Gohan knew to listen. He had an amazingly good memory for one his age, and was also much smarter than the average 4-year-old. His mom made sure of that. Because of his father, he had already made numerous moral pledges on never hurting innocent people and to always protect those who were weaker. Although, with his dad, he always got nuggets of wisdom unexpectedly, and as a result they weren't quite as easy to remember as the words on the pages of the textbooks that his mother had given him. Thus, Gohan made sure to diligently practice and write them down at night to ensure that he never forgot even one of the things he had promised his daddy. On those rare days he got to go out with his father to wherever it was his daddy was going. He usually saw him training or something similar. When one day he asked him why it was that he trained so often in all these different places, he said that it was to protect people. He said that to protect those who are weaker from the strong, you yourself have to be stronger than the strong. Gohan had barely understood at the time what he meant by that and why he had to train to do that, and although now he somewhat comprehended the logic, he still hardly really understood. He guessed that he just didn't understand the evils of the world yet, why there was war and conflict, why people did bad things. After all, reading it in a book isn't much when faced with the real thing. Time after that was spent with them all getting to know all of what had happened since they had last parted, how their lives were going. with Gohan being the biggest unveil of the evening, followed by Yamcha, Goku and the rest talked on, skipping stones among other things. Gohan was still very nervous and cautious around the other people there, making sure to stick close to his dad and his leg at all times, but he was finally starting to warm up to them a bit. It was when Goku and the rest were interrupted by a person flying toward the island that they stopped their easy conversations and socializing to see what was up and who it was. They had just been reminiscing about some of the wishes made by the Dragon Balls, analyzing the things they had done and found out about them as well as possible wishes that could be made in the future. They found out that although knowing more than practically anyone else on Earth, they still had very limited knowledge on the subject. At least Bulma speculated and deducted. Goku just kind of nodded along and Krillin was little better than him in the intellect when in comparison with Bulma. The two of them just ended up leaving her to talk and speculate by herself with Master Roshi, and that was for not so pure reasons while they went up to the small beach lining the small island to greet the incoming person whoever it was. They felt unfamiliar, so Goku and Krillin made sure they were both on guard. The person who landed looked weird to say the least. They had all assumed that it would be someone that they knew, seeing as they had known of all the people on Earth that were capable of flying. At least to their knowledge. All the same, he was a stranger to Gohan, who cringed behind his daddy, and he was scary. The mysterious man was wearing a strange armor that only covered the vitals and the shoulders, and his long onyx hair was untamed and wildly running down his back. He was wearing a sort of small, half-glasses thing with the other half over his ear. If you went by the look on his face, he seemed as though he owned the world and was disappointed with it. Goku couldn't tell what or who this new arrival was, but he felt dangerous and strong. Now that he was landed right in front of them all, they got the full brunt of his ominous aura. He was exuding a sense of power, confidence, and danger. Not a good combination in all of Goku's experiences. Looking at his daddy, Gohan saw him tense up. It was unlike anything he had ever really seen before, especially coming from his daddy. Very observant of his father, Gohan became even more scared. Taking a defensive stance and subtly dislodging Gohan from his leg, Gohan's dad made sure that the less powerful of the group were all behind him, making that practically everyone on the island. Gohan didn't quite notice this defense, but he was clinging to his father's leg again as quickly as he was able, and this time hugging it closer than he had earlier. It was the strange man who first broke the silence. What was this I heard about Dragon's Balls? The tension was so thick in the air that it could be cut with a butter knife and served on toast. DBZ 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 DBZ. Gohan cowered in fear in the small space provided for him in the small white capsule-looking spaceship. He wondered at how the afternoon could go so wrong, at how his entire day could go so wrong. He was still in shock from what he had witnessed earlier. His father, his indestructible, strong daddy, had been defeated with hardly a second glance. Gohan worked out subconsciously that it had been an intimidation tactic of sorts at the time, a means to an end you could say, but he was still in shock, and all he knew was that his condition was getting more and more severe. He could hear himself breathing fast, hyperventilating really, but it sounded and seemed more as though he was an observer and not in his own body. Like it was someone else who was going into shock. He felt a chill creep into his being, etching itself into the very edges of his small existence. He knew that he was shaking, but it was hardly worth noting. Nothing was worth noting. His daddy was dead. Gohan's thoughts were jumbled, going through loops, backtracking, making ideas, altering them, flashing back to what had happened, backtracking, making blunt, factual statements. The cycle was endless. His young mind just couldn't take it. His already dimming vision seemed to blacken ever more around the edges. Not that he could see much anyways, stuck as he was in the ship thing. Not that there was much to look at. Focusing on something else, anything else, Gohan stared at the window on the dim space pod that he was trapped in. Not the crater of destroyed land that was around the place where the pod had landed, not the raw earth with blades of grass and rocks splayed randomly about, not the patch of disturbed earth where Raditz had thrown him down harshly before tossing him in here to shut him up. Gohan simply stared at the window material itself. The shiny, tinted glass, dissecting it in his mind. Gohan wondered at the materials that could have been used to make it. He felt his heart rate begin to steady, as well as feel his breathing becoming less irregular. Staring at the window, he felt as though the only thing that existed in that moment were him, and it. There was nothing else. Gohan felt as the window got closer and closer, clearer and clearer, until finally Gohan could see nothing. DBZ 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 DBZ. Gohan sank into the blackness that was his subconscious. After floating for a while, he felt more than heard a pop, and suddenly he was back to where he had been that evening when Raditz had arrived on the sandy beach. But the more Gohan tried to run away, to move, to prevent what he knew was coming, what he knew would happen, the more he realized that he couldn't do a thing. He couldn't do a thing but watch powerless. And though he tried over and again to convince himself that this was only a flashback, that this was only in his mind, it was his dream, he could control it. He found himself unable to do anything. In the beginning, right after the weirdo had landed, his father had asked the man, in a demanding no-nonsense voice, who he was. But, as though he hadn't heard him, the man asked again about the Dragon Balls. Becoming annoyed when he was not answered, he jerkily reached up to his eyeglass thing, and he pushed a switch on it. It was now blinking, very slowly. It was as though he had switched it into sleep mode or something. However, Gohan didn't have much time to ponder at this mysterious action, as the man spoke soon after. Giving them all a look as if saying that they were all insects about to be squished under his boot, he asked the same question about the Dragon Balls again for the third time. But this time there was an added threat. It was a threat to harm Kakarot and all that was dear to him if he did not inform his dear brother Raditz what the Dragon Balls were and what they did and what they were capable of. To say that everyone was surprised at his comments would be an understatement. At once, Goku asked the question that had been on all their minds. What did he mean when he said, Kakarot, and who was his brother? This only seemed to infuriate Raditz, and he began screaming about forgetting his mission to destroy Earth, and something about Saiyans, and a disgrace to the entire race. And then he began ranting on about the loss of his tail when he saw that Gohan's daddy had none. When his crazed, insanity-riven eyes landed on Gohan, cowering behind his father, Gohan could do little but whimper. Gohan's daddy tensed at the interaction as well as the sound of Gohan's whimper until he was both harder and more sturdy than a statue and more ready to spring into action than a pouncing lion. Gohan couldn't take his eyes off of the long-haired man, however, holding his gaze, unable to look away. And as soon as he blinked, breaking the stare with Raditz for shorter than a millisecond, he was yanked on the tail by some unseen force behind him and his daddy. Just as abruptly, Gohan found that he was in front of the whole friendly group on the island, including his father, and he couldn't move. Gohan, knowing what would come next, tried to force himself to scream. He tried to prevent what had happened. He cried out with all his power to his body to do something, anything. But nothing changed. He was as he had been not hours before. Captured and helpless. A liability. Some would argue that he was only 4, that he was too young to have really made a difference, but Gohan knew better. He knew that if he had only been better, if he had only been smarter, if he had only been stronger, if he had only been faster, then he could have prevented what happened next. He could have prevented his father's death. But no, Gohan was forced to watch, numbly, as he was held up by the tail, in pain and unable to move. Both due to the agony of being held up by his tail, and by the fact that he could not change anything that was going on here. He was absolutely helpless. Listening, he heard uselessly as the man cooed about how it was that Kakarot had had a son, how it was sweet that he had a tail, and how he would make an interesting gift if he ever got around to it. About how he knew just how he could take good care of his dear nephew. Gohan heard the tone of voice, and he was pulled up so that he was practically nose to nose with the monster. And at that moment Gohan knew that he was going to die. There was no mercy in those eyes. Those were the eyes of a person who loved to kill and had done it many times before. They were the eyes of a person who had no soul, no consciousness to tell him what was right and wrong, only what was fun and would keep himself going. They were eyes full of greed and selfishness. Gohan heard his daddy's voice call his name, and he wanted to respond, but he couldn't. He was too petrified and too hurt. Instead, all that came from him was an involuntary pained moan that was pulled unwillingly from his throat as Raditz tightened his grip over his tail. He was looking at the sand on the beach once again, immobile as his dad and Raditz talked. Raditz stated that he would be taking his nephew and the Dragon Balls. The crazy man was never told what it was that the Dragon Balls did, but he had heard enough about making a wish and how it would come true. Although disbelieving, Raditz could tell it was the truth. Demanding that they give him the Dragon Balls at once, he shot out a bright concentrated beam from his fingers when no one moved to comply. The energy beam hit, and he heard a thud of a body hitting the ground, but all Gohan could see was a puddle of red beginning to form at the edges of his vision. It was the horrified gasps and the whispered, "Goku, that had his world stop turning and him seeing red. He felt his blood stop with his heart, then suddenly it was burning like fire through his veins. Gohan could only stare at the puddle as it became more and more widespread, meaning that he could see it more and more. Raditz's laughter was grating on his nerves, hurting his ears with its pitch and proximity. It was burning his blood from the inside out. He could feel every part of himself more and more with every passing second. And yet he could also feel his handle on reality slip as well, his rationality beginning to slip away. He couldn't remember much as soon as the feeling began intensifying. The stronger it became, the less he could recall clearly. But he remembered clearly. Oh, so clearly did he remember it when Raditz had lifted him and pointed him towards his father. His dead father, lying in a pool of his own blood. His glassy eyes still open and somehow surprised and defiant even in death. That was when Gohan snapped. It was after that he could remember nothing but bits and pieces. He remembered screaming and blood. Whose blood and whose screams, however, he couldn't be too sure. But he did remember with a sick satisfaction that one of the screams had been Raditz's agonized yell, but it was the only one he knew for sure was his. For all Gohan knew, they could have been his own screams and yells. Gohan cringed internally, because he had not been in the right frame of mind at the time, he only certain bits and pieces. He was only thankful for that for a moment as he was rushed into the next scene he could faintly remember. He had come to later in the air, being dragged like a lifeless sack of potatoes by a very injured Raditz. Upon arriving at the pod, Raditz tossed and locked Gohan's crying, limp, and hurting body up into his space pod thing. At least Gohan assumed that was what it was. DBZ 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 DBZ. Gohan woke to a blasting pain in his cheek. Feeling his brain scramble around in his head as the force of the blow ricocheted him above the inside of the small pod, Gohan looked up once he felt he was able. He was quickly reverting to his shocked state as he saw that it was none other than Raditz standing over top of him. He didn't know why it surprised him so much. Gohan supposed that even though he knew it was impossible, he still expected his daddy to show up and save him from the bad man like he always did. Raditz had his clenched hand with bloody knuckles held aloft, near his chest. His armor looked worse for wear, broken in body in places, and he was favoring one leg, all the while dripping rich thick blood onto the torn earth below. The expression on his face was anything but sane. The large man looked down on Gohan, and Gohan began to wonder why he was even alive. As though from far away he could hear the man speak, but it was unclear exactly what it was he had said, but what he could get through his muddled mind was horrifying. And when Raditz saw the realization and fear hit the boy, he smiled a cruel smile. Getting into the cramped craft with the injured child, he prepared for a long journey. His body protested so soon after the last one, but he didn't care. Gohan could hardly tell as the scary man got in with him, causing the irony smell of blood coming from the both of them to become almost overwhelming in the small pod. All that was going through his mind was what Raditz had said before. Like a broken record it kept repeating. "I'll take you with me. Added bonus. You'll get what you deserve. Frieza's new pet. Sure you'll have fun breaking you. Always did love occasionally seeing the things he does for entertainment and training. I could never stomach it for too long though. You're never escaping." It was when Raditz shoved a large needle in his arm, roughly injecting who knows what into his system, that Gohan's mind gradually shut down completely, stopping the twisted mantra going through his head. His last thought was a desperate plea to the universe that this was all just a really long nightmare. Gohan woke slowly. It took him longer than it probably should have. He felt as though the blood flowing through his veins had been replaced by sludge. His whole body hurt and was sore, his muscles stiff and borderlining on numb. Opening his eyes, usually an easy task, took nearly all his concentration and strength. He moved his eyes to look at his surroundings, and even that hurt. Wondering what was happening and why he wasn't in his comfy and warm bed at home, safe and sound under the covers with his mommy and daddy in the next room, he sat there quietly staring at his cramped, darkened surroundings. That was when reality had hit him, taking his breath away with the same force as a sledgehammer ramming into his chest. And with that same blow he felt his heart giving away under the force. His dad was the first thing that came into clarity for him, the first thing that he worried about. The first thing he felt for, as the emotions filled his heart up with dread. Nearly as painful as the state his body had been in when he had first woken up, only it was a different kind of pain, a more deeply lasting gash on his heart. But they had been talking about Dragon Balls, right? Something like being able to make wishes. Although he had been shy and scared and not really contributing to the gathering's conversations, he had been listening attentively to all of them. If it was true, then didn't that mean that they could wish people back to life, including his daddy? Feeling hope flow through him, Gohan did his best to smile, feeling it twitch at the corners of his mouth, making his stiff cheek muscles spasm with the effort. All despite the current situation. His daddy would be okay. That's what really mattered. It was then and only then that he began to think about himself. What was he going to do? They had to use the wish to bring his daddy back, not on wishing Gohan back to Earth. That would accomplish nothing. So no, they would wish his daddy back. They had to. If they did that, then maybe his daddy could come and save him. Gohan felt even more happy than he already was, but that was before he remembered the lifeless eyes looking back at him from the ground. His father's lifeless eyes, usually so bright and full of love. Either way, would they even be capable of wishing Gohan back home to Earth in the first place? No, it wasn't even worth considering. Gohan's predicament wasn't near as bad as his father's. His father had died. Feeling his battered heart cringe away from more thoughts about his father, Gohan brushed off the wayward memories tickling his conscience, memories about a textbook featuring an old philosopher to the deepest recesses of his mind. The war philosopher had stated simply in one of his shortest, and yet most profound statements, "There are some fates worse than death." Gohan thought about his dad and thought about his situation. His dad's predicament was definitely worse than his. After all, what could be worse than death? And such a gruesome one at that. The only solace Gohan could find in it was the fact that it had been quick. His daddy had been so quickly killed, defeated really. But that couldn't be true, could it? His daddy was the strongest man in the world. Gohan felt mostly reassured at that factual thought, but again, there was that little niggle of doubt, just barely trickling into the back of his head. The world, Gohan realized, looking outside at the seemingly endless amount of stars and planets whizzing by at amazing speeds, he realized that his world was Earth, and when looking out at the universe passing by so fast, it seemed so small. Gohan never knew that there were men all throughout the universe that were so strong. He had never given any real thought to it. He had known that there would be life. After all, the universe is far too vast and growing for Earth to be the only star system containing sentient life. Add in the fact that his daddy, although not anymore, and him both had tails, and from what he had seen so far in his life, no one else did, and Gohan had no doubt about aliens. It was simply common sense, obvious even to children. But that there were bad people that were so strong out there among the stars, he had had no clue that it would be that way, and he was having trouble wrapping his head around the concept. The concept that corruption and just plain badness was so widespread and real. Twitching when he heard a grunt behind him, Gohan tensed up. His muscles cramping painfully in protest to his sudden clenching, Gohan still didn't dare make a sound. He was in an uncomfortable position in the one-person craft, and to put it that way served as a gross understatement. Raditz had taken up the position of the regular single passenger, predictably sitting in the provided cushiony, slightly reclining seat rather comfortably. On the other hand, there was Gohan, and he was forced up against the front of the pod near the small window, entrapped between both Raditz's beefy legs and the wall of the craft. He was in a fetal position, curled up tightly, taking up as little space as possible, unconsciously, uselessly, attempting to make himself less noticeable as well, and leaning against the craft. His elbows pulled in tight against his chest and legs. Gohan shivered slightly. Whether it was from fear, or if it was from the chill seeping into his bones through the wall, the very wall barring him from the merciless vacuum of space, he didn't know. Gohan was unsure as to whether or not he should make a move, especially after considering the situation he was in. As it was, he was basically numb and sore from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. He could hardly move a muscle unconsciously, let alone on purpose. But the position he was in left much to be desired, and he feared it was making his body's aches and pains worse the longer he sat in the position. He wanted to move so bad, but he feared the consequences if he did. So he sat and thought about it, considering the possible repercussions of his actions. How much he wanted to move, where he would move, if he would even be able to move at all if he decided to. Thinking. It seemed to be all that he was doing. Ever since he woke up, all he had been doing is thinking. He had always been a thoughtful child, but usually it was about much more light-hearted things. Things like the sky and why it was blue, about the dinosaurs and why they were big. Where did the food he and his father so dearly loved come from? And things like why when he fell down, it hurt. The simple questions he assumed every child at his advanced age would think about and question. Now he was pondering more serious, grown-up things. Things like life and death. He was only a little kid. Why was he thinking such sad things? Gohan didn't want to be thinking about such horrible things. And it was only made more terrible in that it was such a stark, harsh reality. His own reality. Gohan just wanted to be thinking about things that didn't affect him so horribly. He didn't want to think about whether or not just moving would get him more hurt. He didn't want any of that. He wanted his mommy and his daddy. He wanted, and even still despite the situation, half expected his mommy and daddy to come and save him. For his mom to come and crush him in one of her trademark angry hugs, screaming about how worried she was and about how much she loved him. To sit him down on the counter after scolding him and kiss all of his boo-boos and make the pain fly away, and how it always, without fail, made him feel better somehow, even though he knew that the pain didn't really fly away. But still, even after reading the book on the neurological process, how the pain was actually just electrical signals traveling between the synapses and to the brain to inform the body that something was wrong and needed to be fixed, Gohan never questioned his mommy. His mommy was the most amazing, the most smart, and the most pretty mommy in the world. Feeling his eyes well up with tears, Gohan didn't move from his position. He at least tried to imperceptibly open and close a hand or wiggle his foot around at the ankle, but it was a slow, scary, and painful process. It was scary to Gohan among other things because he was having so much trouble doing such a seemingly simple task. Never before had he had so much trouble with moving his own. He had never been so weak. As if Gohan's inner turmoil wasn't enough already, Raditz decided at that moment to twitch violently, hitting Gohan and ramming him up even more against the wall of the ship. Whether or not it was intentional on Raditz's part, he didn't know, but it hurt and it was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Gohan felt more tears leak out of his red and swollen eyes, undoubtedly leaving more tracks on his blotchy, dirty face. He had previously had the notion that there were no more tears to cry, but today turned out to be a day full of surprises and shock. Or was it still today? How long had Gohan been unconscious in the pod? What day was it exactly? Raditz groaned loudly, interrupting Gohan's puzzled thoughts, and Gohan felt his ribs creaking with the unexpected continual pressure being forcefully applied to his small and weakened form. It was coming from the thick tree trunk legs that were seeming unaware, or uncaring, of his presence. Raditz seemed to be having a mini stretching session upon waking up, and the fat crocodile tears streaking down Gohan's face seemed to have a mind of their own. Gohan was hardly even aware that they were still flowing at this point. All he knew was that if Raditz didn't stop anytime soon, Gohan would end up looking disturbingly similar to a bug on a capsule car's windshield. Thankfully, on that thought, Raditz chose that moment to release his stretch, and Gohan sighed lightly in relief. Only to in the released air again too suddenly and choke on it when the spaceship jolted with no warning. Panicking at the unexpected fluctuation in the pod's activity, Gohan looked out the window with wide, disbelieving eyes. What had been free, beautiful space was now taken over by the metallic gaping hulk of a monstrously sized mother ship. A three-pronged claw extending from the inside of a wall within the mouth of the monstrosity had attached itself to the minuscule in comparison ship Gohan and Raditz were occupying, and it was now reeling the little pod in like a fish on the line. Gohan could only hope that that was the only similarity between a fisherman's catch and the pod. He really hoped that Raditz didn't go through the trouble of bringing him here just to eat him. He didn't think his mommy ever actually meant it when she told him that strangers wanted to take him home and eat him. He had always thought it was something she said just to make sure he didn't wander off. Gohan could see the small side opening that the pod was approaching, and going by the size and angle, the little ship would fit in perfectly. Gohan could feel a heavy coating of foreboding settle over top of him, gaining more and more momentum the closer they got. It was like a stone resting atop his chest, gradually getting heavier and heavier. "I'm going to enjoy this, brat." Raditz's amused voice rasped from just behind him, making him jump. Gohan was startled. He had hardly noticed the man was awake. After all, he had hardly made a sound after stretching other than to breath, let alone fully coherent. Especially after considering the fact that Gohan had been so sorely focused on the approaching compartment at that particular moment, it shouldn't come as such a surprise that he hadn't noticed Raditz's behaviors behind him. Focusing now, and more conscious of his surroundings, Gohan could more clearly hear Raditz behind him as the man chuckled dryly to himself. It was a brutish, cruel laugh. and it wasn't helped by the fact that the man sounded as though he hadn't spoken in years. Again, just how long had they been in the pod? Gohan swallowed, and though he tried, he couldn't stop the hair on his tail from flaring up in alarm. The furry appendage was currently curled around his waist protectively, and it was as stiff and sore as the rest of him, resembling concrete more than a limb with actual flesh and blood. Gohan gulped loudly, his dry mouth and throat clicking and sticking together apprehensively. Raditz, seemingly hearing the sound, became noticeably more spirited in his coarse laughter. The mechanical whirring as a result of the reeling in of their pod stopped with a sharp jerk, slamming Gohan's face into the window he was looking out of previously, both immediately busting open his lip and giving Gohan a nosebleed simultaneously. Yelping hoarsely in pain and surprise, Gohan was overshadowed by his uncle's now robust laughter. The man must have found Gohan's mishap hilarious if his reaction was anything to go by. "Oh, it will be fun breaking you. Perhaps even easier than I imagined." Raditz choked out. The words were almost not heard by Gohan in his pain-filled stupor. Clutching at his nose, trying to stem the flow of blood coming out of it, Gohan couldn't contain the whimper. It felt as though it had come from deep inside of him, a reactant not just to the pain in his face, but to the pain in his heart as well. So light was the sound that it would be barely audible to human ears, and yet it was so deep and resounding within the soul of the listener who did happen upon it. Well, it would be to those with a conscience or mercy. To the one blinded by bloodthirst and revenge as well as greed, one such as Gohan's uncle for example, as an equivalent Gohan may as well have told a witty joke. Panting like a wounded animal, Gohan tenderly felt at his split lip with his tongue. The taste of blood had blossomed in his mouth the second he had made contact with the glass. The iron-like tangy flavor coating his tongue and throat densely sickened him and made him nauseous. When the pod started shaking and bumping immediately following the initial jolt resembling a capsule car going over a particularly rocky road, Gohan made sure to keep his face a safe distance away from the now dirty and blood-splattered glass. Well, he tried to. There was very little room in the pod to begin with, and Gohan had found it hard to move even before Raditz had woken up and limited Gohan's space further. Using the hands clutching at his face as a buffer should he hit the glass again, Gohan did his best to remain silent and still. The sniffling and shaking though, as well as the tears now mixing with the blood flowing off of his chin onto his filthy clothes were both things he found that were out of his control. Gohan guessed it was Raditz's good mood that prevented him from simply killing the young boy then and there. Truthfully, Gohan had no clue what it was other than revenge that was keeping Raditz from just making the one final decision and ending Gohan's life. Raditz had spoken of another man, one who would supposedly break Gohan, as his uncle was so very fond of putting it. Then the pod, with a final head-busting tug into the mothership that Gohan was proud to say didn't affect him as bad as the first one, was in place in its designated niche. The dirty window before Gohan showed nothing but a dull gray metal slab. There were some more whirring mechanical sounds coming from behind them before the pod seemed to shut down with a well-oiled click, and the two occupants were thrust into an absolute darkness. Slowly, with the hissing of escaping and depressurizing air, the front of the pod opened into a brightly lit desolate hallway with gray easily cleaned standard walls and floors. Gohan yelled out in surprise and pain as he was punted unceremoniously out of the pod. They had arrived. Gohan's eyes darted around fearfully, by the time he had peeled himself up from the metallic smooth floor, wincing at the sensation of his body sticking to it messily. Raditz had disembarked from the pod as well. As if by magic, the once empty hallway attained another inhabitant. Gohan had not even heard him coming, which was weird considering Gohan had excellent hearing. Usually he could easily hear his mom's soft footsteps padding throughout the house in the morning, before he had to get up to eat and study. Considering his mother was a world-renowned martial artist, this was no small feat. Although Gohan was not supposed to know of his mother's reputation, his dad had gotten a real goose egg after that one. Shaking the fond memories from his head, Gohan returned to reality, albeit reluctantly, to analyze the reasons behind him not hearing someone approaching. Because of this, Gohan assumed that the reason he had not heard the stranger coming was because he was in such a terrible condition. It relieved him some that he was no longer alone with Raditz, but the more logical part of him was frozen stiff with terror. He guessed that Raditz had to have been exaggerating before when he spoke of giving Gohan what he deserved, or something along those lines. But even after working this out, Gohan could do little but feel fear. especially after getting a good look at the new visitor joining him and his uncle in the desolate halls. The alien, most likely a male if Gohan had to guess, was a gross, mottled shade of green. In addition to being tall and bony, he also had what looked like warts and strange-colored freckles all over what was revealed of his shiny skin. This only added to the effect of his two small squinting eyes and blood-red wiry hair. He was wearing the same strange armor as Raditz, only more clean and well taken care of. The guards and plates covering his vitals looked freshly waxed, seeming to sparkle in the light. There was no dirt, bloodstains, or whatever else was marring Raditz's suit to be seen on the new alien's apparel. Gohan didn't think he wanted to know the significance behind the particular matching uniform that the two were wearing. As far as he was concerned, it was too much similarity to Raditz to be anything pleasant. Despite all his other disturbing characteristics, Gohan still found that the most disconcerting thing about it turned out to be the gleeful smile nearly splitting his face in half. His pointed needle-like, discolored teeth seemed to be aimed directly at him. Gohan couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight, he just stood and stared in mute horror. By the looks of it, when his mind slowly began to process again, Gohan figured that Raditz and it seemed to be conversing. Gohan snapped out of his trance abruptly the moment he felt a large long-fingered hand pick him up by the scruff of his neck. Yelping in pain, Gohan grasped at his captor's beefy fingers, attempting to pry them from around his neck. They could have been carved from diamond for all the good it did him. Eyes wide, his hands still tugging fruitlessly at the one wrapped around his neck, Gohan's vision darted around spasmodically, and saw that the skinny green alien was now walking away with a steady gait. Choking slightly due to the unforgiving grip, Gohan felt Raditz follow the alien confidently. Holding Gohan in the air like a trophy, akin to a sure knight carrying the spoils of war back to his king. Raditz trailed closely behind the green alien as he traveled through a veritable maze of hallways. They walked in complete silence, broken only by Gohan and his occasional grunts and chokes. Through all the twists and turns they roamed. Gohan tried his best for a time to remove the hand holding him captive, but after he didn't know how long, he finally gave up struggling. Raditz didn't even seem to notice. Walking along through the halls, not even the subtlest change in pace, no matter what Gohan did. It made no difference whatsoever. And so he did nothing, becoming dead weight, limbs dangling in Raditz's grasp. Thinking of possible scenarios to get away. He thought for a second and remembered the fishing show he had caught a glimpse of on his grandpa's television once. It had displayed a fish cleverly escaping from certain death by fooling the fisherman that he had complete control. After going limp for a little bit, the fish had sprung up quickly, surprising his captors and escaping in the process. Gohan figured that if a fish could do it, then so could he. Gohan didn't think about what he would do if and when he escaped. He didn't bother to think of what would happen if he was caught again. He only focused on what he needed in the now, and in the now he needed to escape. Forcing himself to relax his muscles more completely, Gohan waited until a strange foreign alien walked by. This one looked to be female and she was wearing. Gohan didn't know what she was wearing, but it wasn't much. Her outfit consisted of ribboned, transparent material, showing of more than it covered if that was possible. She was pale purple in skin color, and she had 2 extra arms, long green slightly curled hair, and big bright pink half-lidded eyes. She seemed to be sauntering down the hallway, barefoot. The way she moved was rhythmic and graceful. She almost seemed like she was floating, and the hypnotic way her clothes moved as she moved seemed to draw the attention of everyone within sight. In this case being Gohan, Raditz, and the strange green frog person escorting them. She was one of the prettiest, strangest, most exotic things Gohan had ever seen. Gohan did his best to snap out of it and tear his gaze away from the she-alien. He came into awareness real quick when he felt Raditz loosen his grip ever so slightly. A lesser person would not have even felt it at all. Raditz had reached over to do something to the alien lady walking by, but Gohan was too preoccupied to see what. He waited until the hand holding him stopped loosening, and before Raditz could even think about tightening it again, Gohan struck. Moving his legs in an upward motion and twisting in an attempt to get free, Gohan rotated in midair with all his might. Hearing a rip from behind him and feeling the already weakened dirty clothes restricting him give way, Gohan dared to think. Feeling the lightness and hope burst inside of him, Gohan kept moving, or at least he tried. Almost at the exact same second he was released, he was once again caught. Gasping, Gohan couldn't make a sound. His tail had been grabbed mid-spin. The sensation was terrible. It was as though Raditz wasn't simply pulling on his tail itself, but trying to pull Gohan's spine out as well. Gohan's eyes widened and his mouth gaped silently as he hung there. It was disturbingly similar to the position he had been in when his father had died. All that escaped him were small gasps, like a fish out of water. If that wasn't enough, Raditz, using his grip on Gohan's tail, rapidly smashed Gohan into the wall a few times. After the third hit, Gohan couldn't count anymore. He did take strange notice of the growing red stain on the wall in front of him. With every hit it grew. When he felt his thoughts become cloudy and his vision got dark, Gohan thought he would be welcomed into blissful unconsciousness. But that fate would be too sweet. As though reading Gohan's thoughts, Raditz stopped what he was doing immediately. Gohan hanging limply in his grasp. Gohan didn't know what happened to the lady alien after that. He didn't even know if they spoke or if they were even moving. For a time all Gohan knew was blurred and sluggish. He was completely numb. As they kept walking for an extended amount of time with nothing happening, Gohan regrettably became more lucid, and he could feel his limp body begin to try to heal itself, becoming rubbery and unwinding. As his body began to shut down at the lack of action, Gohan could acutely feel all the aches and pains in his muscles. The stinging, stabbing sensations ratcheting through his body in steady waves. It would seem as though with relaxation came nothing but pain. The adrenaline that had once been flowing so potently through his veins, keeping the pain on the edge of his mind, was now retreating back to who knew where. Gohan began crying at the pain again. The silent tears streaming down his face, dribbling off of his face into his hair and onto the floor. His face at this point was unrecognizable with all that had happened. He was starting to wonder if he would ever be clean again. With his walking captors ignoring him still, even now that he was crying, nothing changed save the fact that the halls were filling. Occasionally crossing their path more and more frequently was the strange-looking alien. The only sense of consistency to be found between them all was their outfit. They were all clad in the same strange uniform. A uniform that Gohan was coming to loathe and fear. Gohan stared at them all as they walked by through watery eyes. Their forms were distorted slightly due to the tears, but their features were not all lost. There were so many different shapes and sizes, and colors. Sometimes humanoid, sometimes less so. Gohan latched on to the passing aliens desperately with his eyes, drinking up the brief distraction they provided, any distraction as much as he could. Anything to keep his mind from wandering to his cruel fate and what was to happen to him. So focused was he on not focusing, Gohan didn't expect the sudden stop of motion. Reluctantly tearing his gaze from the small purple humanoid with an antenna and webbed feet strutting down the hallway, Gohan looked up to notice that they had stopped in front of a lavish door. Well, more lavish than the others, seeing as all the others that they had passed in the hallway were the same drab metal as the floors and ceiling. The door that they were currently standing in front of was a burnished gold color, the waxed metal gleaming in the light. Gohan fleetingly wondered what it was made of. Some alien metal, no doubt. He wondered what planet minded and if it was anything like Earth, like his home. Gohan spared a glance to Raditz to see that the big burly man looked to be a tedious mixture between excited and nervous. Gohan felt his insides chill. Gulping, the inside of his mouth feeling more like sandpaper than ever before, he looked at the door with a new attitude. What could possibly be inside that room that could make Raditz shake in his boots? It would seem as though, willing or not, he was about to find out. DBZ 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 DBZ. Gohan drifted in and out of awareness. The gentle flowing sounds of water and mechanical whirring lulling him in and out of awareness. He felt nothing to show for the complete emotional roller coaster he had been on since he last woke up, and even for some time before that. He felt light, weightless, and there was no pain. Pain. Wait a second, surprisingly it was strange for there to be no pain. It was a thing that Gohan had become accustomed to already. He found it shocking that he had already become so used to something so ugly. His mind wandered to those books on adaptation and Darwinism. Slowly he drifted off to sleep, recalling his mom's soft voice as she read the books to him as he went to bed. DBZ 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 DBZ. Gohan came into consciousness much more abruptly this time. He had been recalling what had happened before he slipped into the blissful darkness. He and Raditz had entered the big open circular room together, the escort alien leaving them not too long after. Gohan had seen 3 people in all in the middle of the room, one sitting in a floating chair-like contraption, the other two flanking him closely. Gohan had felt a strange, powerful feeling of abject fear jolt through him the second he laid eyes on the floating alien. It came across as male, but it seemed more asexual than anything. And dangerous. Definitely dangerous. Gohan could feel his synapses going off like crazy, instincts telling him that a dangerous predator was in the premises and he should get out, get away, now. But no, it was not to be. As Gohan stared wide-eyed at the middle alien, not daring to look away, hardly even daring to blink, he was aware of the fact that Raditz and him, were having a conversation. When before Gohan was worth less than a passing glance, after hearing Raditz say something about half-breed filth, and, for your amusement, however, Gohan received a gleeful stare and amused twisted smirk. It was similar to that of a spoiled child Gohan's own age unexpectedly receiving a much-coveted toy. A lesser boy would have wet his pants at the sight. It was then that Gohan focused more on the conversation, his now dry eyes taking in the situation. Raditz was still in the process of finishing his speech. Gohan came in at Dragon Balls. He could feel dread seep into and settle in his bones. He knew where this was going. He could assume that the sentence began with being able to make a wish. Gohan had only been here for a few minutes and he knew with startling clarity that this thing being allowed to make a wish would not end well. In fact, he knew that it would be downright disastrous. And so he knew that he had to do something. It was worth more than him. And yet as he thought this he could feel the terror and the pain paralyze him. He could do nothing. The helplessness drowning him, Gohan tried to force himself to take action. He had been there when the Dragon Balls had been mentioned. He knew just as much if not more than Raditz. He knew of the implications of such powerful objects. But for some reason he could not move. Every time he would resolve himself to move, he kept flashing back to all the other times he had either attempted to escape or otherwise brought attention to himself. The pain was fresh in his mind and his body was still potently feeling it as well. So fierce was his internal struggle, that he failed to comprehend the ever-approaching sex-less alien, as well as the ever-tensing state of the man behind him. Just when Gohan felt he had finally mustered up the courage one last time to say something, something to throw them off the trail, something to discourage them, something to mislead them, anything really, disaster struck in the form of a long white and purple tail. Before Gohan could even open his mouth to say something, before he could comprehend anything in his young but overly mature brain, he was splashed with a warm substance. He was covered in blood. It was not his own blood splattered about, but Raditz. Gohan remained silent as he stared at the source of the blood everywhere. Impaled fully through the chest was the man who had kidnapped him. The impossibly strong and seemingly invincible man who had killed his dad, the strongest man on Earth who until recently Gohan had also considered invincible, was lifted off the ground impaled like a bug before him, utterly defeated. Gohan hadn't even seen it, it happened so fast. Pale and stuttering with blood flowing from him freely, Raditz hung there like a broken rag doll, before he was abruptly flung away with seemingly nary a thought. He slammed brutally into a shiny waxed wall that looked exactly the same as the door they had entered through, before dropping limply to the ground, unmoving. He was, as far as Gohan could tell, dead, with his armor cracked and bloodied more so than it already was. Gohan could swear that he heard things snapping that wasn't the bodysuit when Raditz slammed into the wall. As Gohan looked he could see Raditz's open eyes glaze over, and although he held no love for the now dead man, Gohan felt the killer was still standing right in front of where Raditz was standing, where Gohan was still standing. He couldn't have been there for more than a few seconds, but to Gohan time seemed to move faster, making those few seconds feel like an eternity. Its tail, stained a dark wet crimson, curled and flicked like a snake's tongue before receding out of sight back to where it was before. The enraged expression the thing had been wearing was now dimmed down some, but was still thunderous. Gohan wished he had listened more to the conversation it had been having with Raditz in the off chance that it could be of help to him now. Turning its head to Gohan, it put on an obviously fake tight smile before saying, "And then there was one." Chuckling to itself delightedly at the cheesy joke with a double meaning, Gohan could only wonder why it was so funny before in an alarming switch, it snapped his attention back to Gohan. Out of nowhere, with no warning, the very same tail responsible for the death of Raditz slammed into Gohan's side, slamming him into the wall opposite to the one Raditz had hit. All the while the thing was screaming madly, incomprehensibly. "Dragon Balls, what a lovely notion, and they will be mine, but the fool ruined it. 1 year he took to inform me, 1 year for Vegeta and Nappa to defect and also go for them. I want the one who was supposed to be monitoring their communications dead. Bring him to me. Call the Ginyu Force, send them after at once. Don't tell them of its powers, just make them bring them to me. And this thing. Get this monkey out of my sight. It enrages me just seeing its species at the moment. Heal the thing for all I care, it's the only slightly intelligent thing Raditz did before I ended his pitiful life. I need a new monkey now any. Gohan missed the last parts as he faded out of consciousness. It wasn't until later, much later, that Gohan realized that he wasn't going home. He wasn't sure how old he was really. Time was different in space, it had no meaning. He had only his thoughts and what little Frieza said about Earth to bide his time. He wondered if everybody was okay. He knew that they had to have beat the bad guys. After all, if they had wished his dad back, he had no doubt that they would have won. His daddy was the strongest. Whenever he thought that though, he only saw a growing pool of red blood and glassy sightless eyes. If he was honest, it was all he could see whenever he closed his eyes really. Unless he was unconscious, a state he found himself in more often than not actually. He found that Raditz's views were not uncommon among the crew. In other words, crying was not an option, only an annoyance. When he had first received his collar given to him after one of Frieza's rages, something about not having enough control over the monkeys, he had cried. It wasn't that long since arriving on the ship, and Gohan only could hold his tears back for so long. What he had received for his tears was enough to make him never cry again. His tearless eyes now understood, viscerally, the philosophies of his former life. He called it that because he didn't want to relate his current situation in any way to the dream that was his life on Earth. Whenever he got supplements for dinner, whenever he was allowed no sleep for who knows how long, whenever he was punished for simply existing as a lower-class creature, he could only do all he could to separate his past from his present. He had become a low-rung trainee, or so he assumed. With all of the training sessions, where he supposedly learned how to fight, he was left afterward to clean the mess and tend to the equipment. When his tail was crushed, when his arm was nearly detached, when his puke was bloody, he still cleaned the mess and tended to the equipment. When he was left unconscious, as was common, he was left until he woke up, or was woken up, to clean the mess and tend the equipment. He was rather numb to it all, he surmised. Thankfully, he guessed, he had his own little bed chamber to himself. Apparently it belonged to the monkeys on the ship. Gohan was left to assume that that meant that it used to be Raditz's and whomever else had a monkey tail and looked like him. It was small and only received enough supplements to keep him alive and able to train. Monkeys don't deserve real food, and he had a slightly cushioned area to sleep in. He knew that considering his treatment thus far, it was miraculous. He knew that it was only because nobody wanted to use the same rooms as monkeys and they were scared of some Vegeta. But Gohan was only thankful. As far as cleaning himself, he was able to do so after training well. After cleaning, it was an electronic cleansing device, but Gohan was still grateful. It took the blood out of his clothes and the grease out of his hair. As was norm for trainees, he wore a black undersuit and white armor. Only those approved for purging were permitted to wear the envied navy blue. When Gohan had first found out what that particular word, purging, had meant, he had vowed to keep his place at the lower rung of trainees. Not that it was that hard, being a Saiyan monkey and a kid. No, he wanted nothing to do with causing others pain and death. He had experienced enough himself to last 1,000,000 planets. If he wasn't barely surviving himself, he would see if he could help the planets being destroyed, but a quick punch to the abdomen always purged such thoughts from his head, among other things. It was an average day: wake up, go to training, prep the room, teacher comes in and directs the sparring matches, class ends, go to back after everyone leaves and tend to immediate dangerous injuries, clean up the mess of blood, teeth and other debris, go to the back and clean everything else, and then head for chambers to eat, sleep, and begin again. It was as he was limping back to his chambers, as he always did, that he was run into. Expecting the usual attack, Gohan had let himself fall to the ground and lay in a fetal position, protecting all he could of himself. Outside the training chamber, fighting back was something to be punished for. Gohan would rather one average set of injuries over the injuries he got when he was feeling a bit more rebellious. He had laid there until he realized that he wasn't going to be punished. No, as he sat up he looked to see that there was more than one person fleeing down the hallway, like the person who had knocked him over. He looked to where they were running from and he heard a bang followed by an explosion. That made him nervous, as an explosion of that magnitude on a spaceship was indeed something to be concerned about. Seeing as he was not dead yet, however, he decided that for now at least, it wouldn't lead to the ship's complete destruction. That is, he was thinking until he was hit by a stray beam of light. He wasn't the only one. No, the people running down the hallway were hit as well, and those still alive and able kept running. Gohan himself was sitting on the ground shocked. Where his left shoulder was, there was a slice running clean through from the outside of his shoulder to about the center of his arm. In shock, the usual pain didn't seem to hit him yet. He numbly realized that the beam must have soldered the wound a bit as it went through. The lack of profuse bleeding made him think this. As if through a tunnel, he heard high-pitched screaming. It was familiar and it sent chills down his spine. What do you mean the Ginyu Force has not responded since they landed? It has been more than enough time for them to make it there and back to me with the Dragon Balls. At this, another beam sliced through the hallway, taking down even more runners and slicing through the outside of Gohan's ear. As the pain kicked in, along with a healthy amount of numbing adrenaline, Gohan dreaded what would undoubtedly come next. He had heard about and now would witness a superpowered temper tantrum. More and more beams shot through the hallway, and from the far-off explosions he heard, they weren't the only beams being shot off. He received another slice further down on his same left arm and a deep slice to his lower left cheek and jaw. Sire, it is likely that they destroyed the planet, even if they have not returned yet. A panicked, pleading voice wheedled, the words making Gohan's heart stop. We received word anyway that there are more powerful and plentiful Dragon Balls on Namek. I have commanded we set course at once, and we are but a few short months away. They will be yours to use as you wish. Lord Frieza. The shaking voice wavered slightly, but Gohan could only repeat what he had said earlier in his head: destroyed the planet. His home, where his heart was, destroyed. He told himself that it wasn't true, and like his father had beaten Vegeta, he was sure he could take these Ginyu Force people, but there were the doubts. He didn't even know if Daddy had defeated Vegeta and his partner, who were supposedly stronger than Raditz. Then this force was sent, that was stronger than Vegeta. Gohan felt like he was choking. He felt like his heart was being chipped away at, like it was being squeezed right through his chest. Before he knew it, as his vision was going blank, a surge of electric gold pumped through him. It was as though he was invincible, and he was mad. So very mad. No more putting up with his situation. His everything that he knew to be good was on the destroyed Earth, the place where he was Gohan. With that gone, who was he even? As his rage grew, so did his power. He could feel his wounds sliding away, but all too soon he was interrupted. His collar, the very one bestowed upon him by this new life, was electrocuting him. It was pumping so many volts through his system he was sure that he wouldn't be able to ever move properly again. His nerves felt as though they were vibrating and tingling and on fire. He heard before he passed out, other lower class lucky enough to receive the collar screaming. One of them sounded really close, but he couldn't be sure that wasn't himself. After what he was dubbing the incident, things went back to normal. Gohan was roughly awakened, and forced to clean the mess of the hallway that he was in, then allowed back to his chamber as though nothing had happened. Thankfully, he was able to sneak a trip to the region tanks. With so many needing usage after Frieza's freakout, Gohan was thankful that things were so hectic and it was easy to get authorization, if only for a little while. As life went on, and the fleet moved ever closer to Namek, Gohan continued on. It wasn't much, but he still told himself that Earth had to be okay. The blind faith keeping his spirit alive, if barely, was seeing him through the days and nights. Gohan noticed that he never slept deeply during the night, and he always woke exhausted and scared, curled in his protective fetal position. It was as he was cleaning the cleansing area, about to partake in a cleansing himself, that the alarms went off. There was little warning after that. Gohan was only given a brief moment of confusion before the ship exploded. Gohan, thankfully, was passed out, and so missed the part where he became flaming debris. He also missed his crash landing into a busy intersection. Unfortunately, he was the only one. Fortunately, he hit nobody, and nobody was killed, and the only damage done was to those who had crashed in their panic. Go give or take a few frustrated civilians. There was no trouble. There was, however, much confusion once they looked inside the crater to see a boy with a tail. "Ing meta," were the first words spoken, before a man wearing ripped jeans and a thin shirt spit into the crater. Striding away angrily, it seemed his actions were not completely approved of by the crowd and no one followed his example. However, there were a few who glared and walked away much the same. Most stuck to their confused expressions, turkey-necking at the scene. There were a few kind souls who bothered to give concerned looks, and even kinder folks who bothered to call the authorities and enter the crater to check on the child. No one bothered to stay with the child on his way to the hospital. Nobody thought much further on the subject. After all, loath as they are to admit it, as of late, things such as this have become a regular occurrence in New York City. Gohan woke up hurting. It wasn't anything new, but everything else was. He was breathing in new scents, he was hearing new things, and he could feel beneath him what felt suspiciously like a bed and sheets. He could smell chemicals and sickness, he could hear the beeping, dripping and whirring of machines, the murmur of conversation. Struggling to open his eyes, he looked around only to see brightness. There was white all around him, and he couldn't help but wonder if perhaps he had died. Struggling to sit up, he could feel himself coming back into himself. His movements were hindered, but nothing he wasn't used to. No, he was more concerned with the windows. Windows that looked out into a busy street and a bright blue sky above. Gohan could feel a burning sensation take over his eyes, but he didn't take note of it much save for the blurring of his vision. Making his way to the window as if in a trance, Gohan couldn't describe his feelings. He could remember blue skies. As he approached the window and he could see more, he noticed traces of greenery. Ignorant to the wild alarm and flatline behind him, he stopped at the window, pressing his hand to it almost hesitantly, reverently. It was actual sky, not the beautiful cold oblivion of space. There were clouds, he was in a natural atmosphere. So absorbed he didn't notice the rushing footsteps and the many people that entered his room. No, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the morning sun, the buildings and their shadows, the freedom. A dream, but it felt so real. Death, but it felt so alive. No, it wasn't until a slender hand gently touched his shoulder. So light it could have been a breeze. It wasn't until he felt that heat he could even bear to tear his eyes away from the beauty in front of him. "Is it real?" he whispered hoarsely. His eyes meeting the slightly blurred form of a woman in front of him. She was wearing peculiar, revealing clothes, and had long black hair. She was by no means unattractive, and in all ways beautiful in appearance, he guessed. He could see in her eyes, sapphire and cautious, ever cautious, looking back at him. She was bending down slightly in order to meet his eyes and be at level with him, but he could only wait for her words. "It is the one thing I have always known for certain, that is real." She had a kind voice, steady and sure. It caused Gohan to feel less twisted inside, and as he looked back outside, saw how devastatingly real it was, how beautiful. He felt something he had not acknowledged or dared to since the beginning of his stay with Frieza. Hope. The end. Now we will see you in the next video.